everybody. Thank you for being here this afternoon on Wednesday, December 3rd. And I'm seeing Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania here, and Columbus, Indiana, Rockford, Michigan, Matthews County, Virginia, Rochester, New York, Brooklyn. Is in the chat today. Western Massachusetts, Vancouver, Washington, Pewaukee, Wisconsin. That's a new one for me. And it looks now as if Facebook is on. So, welcome everybody to a conversation today with New York State Representative Zohran Mamdani, who is the New York City mayor elect. Thank you so much for being here, Representative Mamdani.
It is such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
So let's start right in with talking about your campaign for the New York City mayorship. Elliot Morris at Strength in Numbers identified yesterday the idea that it's really you who brought the term affordability into public conversation, which now everybody is using. And certainly you emphasize that, but it strikes me that what you were talking about was not just costs, but rather a larger issue in American democracy. Am I right about that?
Absolutely. I often speak in New York City about the greatest mayor we ever had being Fiorello LaGuardia. And he spoke about the fact that you cannot preach self-government and liberty to people in a starving land. And I think the more that we think of democracy as solely an ideal or a value to be protected, as opposed to something that has to show its relevance to the struggles of working people in their day-to-day lives, the more that we will actually lose that democracy. And when we were talking about affordability, we were also talking about the fact that there is this ever widening chasm between the difficulty that New Yorkers are facing in affording the city that they love and their ability to belong to that city and to belong to the ideals, the fabrics, and the democracy of that city. And this is, while the most expensive city in the country, it is not in fact unique and distinct to our city. It is a crisis that people are facing across the country that might be measured in different things depending on where you are, but it's a crisis all the same, where people are struggling with both the smaller and the larger questions all at once.
Okay, I want to dig into that in a little bit, but before I get there, can you talk about how your approach to organizing a political campaign actually reflected concepts of democracy?
I when we began the campaign, there's an immense amount of pressure at that time to go through what consultants would advise you with. They would say, for example, that you need to poll test a number of the ideas that you foreground. You need to wait until you have those results before you spell out what exactly the campaign is. And we took a very different approach where we didn't have enough money for polling from the first days. Instead, we actually spoke to New Yorkers. We asked New Yorkers, listened to New Yorkers, and grounded a campaign in three central ideas. And those ideas were to freeze the rent for rent stabilized tenants, of which in New York City there are more than 2 million out of a city of 8.5 million, to make the slowest buses in America fast and free, and to deliver universal childcare. And democracy, as you've gestured, it isn't simply something at a ballot box. It's the notion also that we have a role in determining our own futures. And what these three crises that we identified all have to do with democracy is that they have been the limitations for people to actually choose their own futures in different ways. For housing, we are speaking about costs that are skyrocketing on an annual basis, and the last and most stabilized segment of the housing market in New York City is the rent stabilized market, and even that has seen a 12% increase in rents over the last few years. Public transit, even just in the name, it's clear that the intention is that everyone can use it, and yet what we find is that $2.90 is out of reach for 1 in 5 New Yorkers now. And finally, childcare is $22,500 a year, and no matter how much money you're earning, that is a significant hit to your ability to actually raise a child in this city. And if we want people to understand themselves as part of a vibrant democracy, we actually have to have them understand their ability to keep living in that democracy and keep determining their own future, as opposed to just being pushed further and further to the brink, where when I go into a building and the first people that I meet, I'll ask them how long their commute was. They'll tell me it's 2 hours. I ask them why. They'll say, because I live in Pennsylvania. or I live in Jersey City, or I live anywhere outside of New York City because of how expensive we've made this city.
Well, something you said there is what we in history and sometimes in politics refer to as agency, the idea that people have to have control over their lives. And that's part of American democracy. And what really jumped out to me about your coalition was, while a number of people focused on the young people who were in your coalition, in fact, it was quite broad, was it not?
It was, and I think it. What was so exciting is the longer the campaign went on, the broader this coalition became, and it's a coalition of those who had never voted before, and a coalition of those who had not voted for a very long time because of the faith that they had lost in their politics. I'll tell you this: the other day, I was at an AT&T store, not too far from where I am now, and my phone had broken. I sat down with an employee and asked them for help, and they asked me if I had been a regular because they could recognize me. And I said, no, I've never been here before. They said, maybe you've walked by. I said, maybe I have. And I said, I'm actually going to be the mayor in about a month. And he was taken aback and started to apologize. I said, there's nothing to apologize for. And then he explained to me his life was getting up in the morning, thinking about work, getting ready for work, getting on the train to go to work, being at work, going home and doing it again. And being in this bubble of his own life where he couldn't afford to look past it. And part of that means not engaging with the politics of the city that he calls home. Part of that is also a reflection for many New Yorkers, though, that whether or not they engage, whether or not they know the names of the next mayor or the current mayor, their life seems to stay the same. And I think that comes back to this notion that you're saying of agency, of democracy, and frankly, the importance of extending democracy from the ballot box into other parts of our lives so that people can actually understand themselves as actors and not simply as subjects to a system that is giving them two options, where they are or worse. And that is not something that's sustainable or tenable, frankly, for our city or for our country.
Well, this is interesting to me. And one of the things that was interesting to me about your candidacy was the degree to which New York City has often been a harbinger of what's going to happen in American democracy elsewhere. So you referenced Fiero LaGuardia, which I love because my mother, who was born in 1922, used to talk about listening to him read the comics. He had a national reach because of that. She was actually not in New York, but she always referred to him as the little flower. But even before that, you get the rise of people like Al Smith at the turn of the last century who recognized that government had to answer the needs of ordinary Americans in order to remain a democracy, which is very much on the table at that point. But that brings up another issue for me that I find interesting about your approach to politics, and that is, I think in the United States, at least since the 1980s, we have tended to think of populism. That is the idea of including people in our system who were not previously included as being an element of the right wing. But in fact, in our history, populism and progressivism usually go hand in hand. And I'm seeing this a lot now. People are talking about the difference between, populism and progressivism, and some people saying, well, I'm a populist, I'm not a progressive, and so on. And yet it seems to me that you are reaching back to that Al Smith populist progressive alliance of the previous century and saying, hey, wait a minute, people, regardless of how they have voted or not voted in the past, tend to want things like transportation and childcare and healthcare and housing, and charting a course forward, as I say, as you just said, without the pollsters and really with talking to people on the ground. Is that a fruitful way to think about this, do you think?
I think it's very fruitful, and I think it's critically important that we identify this as being a part of our nation's history, that we are actually reaching back towards, that there is a legacy that we are looking to be a part of, as opposed to inventing something entirely new. And it's as you said, when I speak to New Yorkers, I am asked far less to describe my politics and far more to answer the question of whether my politics includes them. And that's what people are interested in. They want to know, are their struggles going to be reflected in your focus? And when you speak about making buses fast and free, universal childcare, freezing the rent, you will see that we're talking about 2/3 or 3/4 of New Yorkers who are in support of these things. And no matter how much they are characterized as if they are marginal positions or radical positions or things of that nature, we find the truth of it is that it is a mainstream position. And what is mainstream about it is that it identifies costs in working people's lives that are limiting their ability to live in this city, whether at all or to a fuller extent. And you speak about Al Smith. I was speaking about Fiorello LaGuardia. You were saying that I think your mother was referring to him as Little Flower, and it's this beautiful nickname of his, which I have to also mention is the name of a great coffee shop in Astoria. If you're ever there on 36th Avenue, um, and and I also think of FDR, who you cannot tell the story, frankly, of LaGuardia without telling the story of FDR. You cannot tell the story of a affirmative municipal vision of what democracy can look like without the relationship with the federal government that it was so built on. And FDR also spoke about, when looking at the demise of democracy, in his words, in several great nations, it was that people gave up democracy in the hopes of getting something to eat. And we often think about a withering faith in democracy as if it is a reflection of an increasing faith in an alternate form of government, when in fact what it is a withering faith in this government's ability to deliver on the material needs of working people. That's what we have to focus on if we want to inspire that faith once again. And I think it is part of a great American history, and also a history not just in this city, but across this country, one that we often paper over or forget, or as you said, start to lose sight of how what is populist can in fact be what is progressive. And I even found this myself, that after the last presidential election, there were obituaries written about the Democratic Party's ability to attract the support of young men, of Asian voters, of immigrants, and the swings in those constituencies towards this administration were written about as if it was final. And I went to two of the neighborhoods in New York City that saw the largest swings, Fordham Road in the Bronx, Hillside Avenue in Queens. And I found at the core of that swing was the desire for an economic agenda that spoke to a skyrocketing cost of living crisis that was being measured in rent, in childcare, in public transit, and even in utilities and groceries. And in fact, if you could offer an alternative economic agenda, you could inspire those same constituencies to come back without having to have a debate around the politics that we describe it, so long as it's relevant to people's lives.
The word inspire is important there, I think, and I think you're right on that. But now the rubber is meeting the road. Now you have to take those ideas and turn them into actual policies. And I would love it if you would talk a little bit about what that looks like. I know you've been very transparent about that. I see you've got Lena Khan on your transition team. She's one of my heroes. How do you foresee taking these ideas and making them real for people?
I think at the core of it is to build a team that is excellent, a team that is characterized by the work that they've done as opposed to the people that they know. And too often in government, it is the exact opposite. And as much as we want to blame these things as if they are all a function of the current federal administration, we have to recognize, in fact, that much of this approach predates that administration. It has become a function of city politics. And I remember one of the things that Lena Khan mentioned to me in one of our first meetings was that when she went to the FTC, that she found, as she described it, a great forgetting, that people had forgotten the laws and the tools that they actually had at their disposal to fight for working people. And I think that we have seen a similar thing here in New York City, where departments that were once storied on the front lines, for example, of fights for civil rights and equal rights, like the law department in New York City, have instead been hamstrung by underfunding and lack of interest and commitment from a city hall. And what that has left us with is a shell of what city government could be. And so I think it comes back to that team. So far, we've made a few key appointments. The first two were of my chief of staff, El Bisgard Church, and of my first deputy mayor, Dean Fullahan. And I'll just use Dean as an example. He's someone who comes into this job with 47 years of government experience. And one thing that I found remarkable when I first met with him was he spoke of the importance of changing the culture of no to a culture of how within city government. And so often, the more time you spend in government, the less ambitious you become about government. And what I have appreciated so much about him and his view of the work that we do is that it is undimmed by the limitations that we've seen over the years, and instead still has this sense of what government's potential is. And to me, beyond just the question of excellence, building a team, you must have the marriage of fluency and ambition and imagination. And too often these are pitted as if they are at odds, when in fact they can live together and showcase an understanding of what has come before us and what has to come now, so that we don't just replicate what we are currently living through.
So let me push a little on that. That's fascinating. The idea that we have hollowed out the laws and the regulations that in the past have served us and have forgotten that they're there. I've never heard anyone articulate it that way. And of course, we see that at the national level, where a lot of people talk about throwing out the Constitution because it doesn't work. And other people say, hang on just a minute. If we actually followed the laws that we have and the constitutional amendments that we have, we wouldn't really need to rewrite it. They're already there. We're just not using them. How do you put teeth into those? You mentioned funding, but I'm assuming that with your background, you're also expecting to be able to bring New Yorkers behind that idea.
Absolutely, I think there's two key things. One is the political will. As you laid out, oftentimes it's not a question of developing new tools, it's whether or not you want to use the ones that you already have. In New York City, we have housing codes already on the books. We have bad landlords that have violated those codes, and they have been charged fees to the tune of $800 million. The city has not collected that money from them, not even a dollar of that $800 million. That's not because of a lack of tools, it's a lack of will. And I lay this out to say that this is quite a simple example of, if you wanted to, then you would. And it's this difference of will that we see even in what we treat as the violation of the law. Wage theft is one of the largest, most pervasive crimes in New York City, and yet we don't treat it with the seriousness of other crimes, and yet it has the potential to debilitate a working person's life. And that's what excites me so much, is that just as much as we have new ideas and a new vision for what city government can do, we also, at the core of it, believe that city government can and should work. And that means utilizing the tools it already has. And I think the second part of this is, we've been told a story that not enough people want to work in public service any longer. We have 17,000 vacant jobs in New York City government. That story has been tied together to say this is simply a reflection of the way things are. We opened up a hiring portal. We received 70,000 applications. So clearly the issue is not a lack of interest. It's actually the lack of interest in filling the positions from the perspective of City Hall. So one of the key things is bringing New Yorkers along with you, where you fully fund city agencies such that we are actually doing this kind of critical work, because the absence of a fully funded agency can be felt, whether it means increased garbage on your sidewalk, or it means a park where we're not actually cleaning up the debris that can then be used as a basis for a brush fire, or it means having lifeguards at every single swimming pool so that people can actually feel safe when they are engaging in one of the best leisure activities in New York City. It's all connected to a vision of an affirmative sense of what city government can do.
Listen, I know you have a heart out, so I'm going to let you go. But I just want to say you've given us an awful lot to think about, and I really appreciate it. I'm fascinated by this moment and this movement in New York City's history and what it says for America. And actually, I'm sitting here plotting, writing about it. So I hope that you will come back, and I will speak for the people here. We wish you the best of luck going forward, and we'll watch what happens with great interest. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, I really, really appreciate it. It's really been lovely, and I would love to come back and keep speaking about this. And I think just even at the beginning, where you were welcoming so many of your viewers from across the country, I know that while our focus here is on New York City, that the questions that you have asked, these are questions that could be asked of anywhere in our country. What's so exciting about this moment is it does feel like there's a reawakening of possibility, where even just the language of politics has felt for so long as if it has to be dark, when in fact it can be light, while recognizing the weight of everything that we are actually speaking about. Because I'll tell you, the mayor of New York City has been described as the second hardest job in the country historically, and people often come up to me and ask me about feeling pressure or burden or obligation, and those are all real. But what is often missing is the opportunity that comes with this. That when you win in elected office, as opposed to in a campaign, you can actually change working people's lives. And that's something they can feel, they can touch, they can breathe. And that is something that is at the core of bringing faith back to our democracy. So thank you so much for having me on. I look forward to staying in touch.
Sounds great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.